Now resume.
Yes, Mr. Commissioner, Cliff Krause for British Columbia. Ms. Panchuk, if we could have page 7 of Exhibit 1856, which is the Table 1. So, Ms. Krywolken, and this is actually summarized at Table 6, but essentially the approach that's being taken here is that province-wide, there'll be a number of requirements under the policy proposal, including protecting in-stream flows, regulating groundwater use, and requiring more efficient use of water and incentives. But in areas experiencing declining water supply, water quality, or deteriorating ecosystems, known as chronic problem areas, additional and more stringent requirements will apply. So the approach is to go to areas based on that kind of criteria. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And dealing with the list of policy directions in Table 1, which of those policy directions have the potential to help sockeye salmon if the legislative proposal is carried forward? The 7 areas listed.
I would say all of them do.
All right. And just if we can turn to page 12, Ms. Panchuk, the under Policy Direction 6, there was a suggestion made, I think yesterday and today, about requiring more monitoring and mandatory monitoring. And is this part of the proposal?
Yes.
All right. And then if we can turn to Ms. Panchuk, if we can turn back to page 8. So, Policy Direction 1, Protecting Stream Health. Can you talk to the Commissioner and tell him briefly the policy direction that's recorded there about in-stream flows will be protected as an environmental value? Can you sort of summarize those bullets for us?
So this speaks to in-stream flows for a range of uses, including fish in decision making. And it articulates that decision makers will be required to make consider in-stream flows in their decisions. Those in-stream flow requirements will be developed through guidelines and standards. And that's the work that we're working on right now in collaboration with DFO. And scrolling down. It's recognized that in setting in-stream flow requirements may reduce the amount of water available in some areas, and that the importance of storage comes into play in those systems that are stressed. It's envisioned through this provision, as well as the regulating during scarcity provision, that some licensees who have, and more senior licensees, I might add, who've never been regulated, may be more regulated more frequently in times of scarcity.
We're going to come back to groundwater use. Policy Direction 4 at page 10 is entitled Regulate During Scarcity. Can you summarize how that might work?
So this is the provision that speaks to introducing more flexibility in the current allocation regime. And it retains the first in time, first in right principle. But it takes more of a the addition is more of a staged approach, where in a time of scarcity or in a drought situation, there would be voluntary measures, whether there's existing drought management plans or water management plans in place. There may be voluntary or mandatory proportional reductions for all licensees. And then that fails to address the situation, their first in time, first in right priority of date would come into play. And in extenuating circumstances, or there's an opportunity for the decision maker to deviate from first in time, first in right. And an example of that is a junior licensee may be a municipality And a senior licensee may be a hay farmer. It may mean foregoing a third crop of hay in a season to ensure that the municipality doesn't curtail use.
Thank you. Yes, at the Auditor General's report, I believe was at, it's now an exhibit 1871. You'd have that. And the provincial government made a response to this, did it not, as part of this document, Ms. Krywolken?
Yes.
And so I just ask Ms. Panchik if you can turn to page 4 of the report. And at the top paragraph on the left. So just speaking generally, the province responded to the 7 recommendations, and that's found in the next 3 pages of the Auditor General's report. Is that correct, Mr. Krywolken?
Yes.
And part of that response will come back to the Water Act modernization process. On the top left, there's some discussion of the current groundwater program. And can you explain the current program as it's set out there?
Mm-hmm. Well, the current groundwater program has been in existence for over 50 years. And while there's no explicit regulation of groundwater use in the province, the groundwater program over the last number of years has drawn on a number of regulatory tools to protect the groundwater resource, including its monitoring program, its aquifer classification and mapping, a lot of outreach work, and provision of well protection toolkits, wellhead protection plans, to name a few. In addition, the groundwater protection reg, as Mr. Davidson mentioned earlier, addresses drilling of wells, operation, construction, maintenance, as well as certification of well drillers and pump installers.
All right, and then turning back, Ms. Panchik, to Exhibit 1856 at page 9, please. Ms. Krywolken, can you explain the policy direction to regulate groundwater use as embodied in this document?
Mm-hmm. So the proposal is to regulate groundwater use in problem areas and all large groundwater wells for large uses across BC. The document speaks to some thresholds that we're continuing to refine and further develop. And as I mentioned earlier, we look at the approximately 100,000 wells in the province that we have in our wells database. The large majority, 90 to 95% of those wells are single-family domestic small uses. And the remaining 10% are larger uses ranging from municipalities, industry, agriculture, irrigation, hatcheries. And it's that 5 to 10% that the focus of regulation of use would be on. And in addition, where there are water-stressed areas, critical priority areas in the province, regulation of the individual well owners. And there's some examples, in particular, Gulf Islands, Okanagan, and others.
Mr. Davidson, if I can ask you to give your perspectives now. So continuing with respect to groundwater, and I guess putting it in broader context, you were asked a question this morning that suggested that all surface water use was licensed in the province, and I understand that neither, for domestic uses, neither surface water nor groundwater is licensed. Is that correct? And can you explain what the rationale would be for that?
Well, I think that this morning we were talking a little bit about what the extent of potential groundwater licensing. And to be clear, there is no groundwater licensing at present. But I think there was some statements around how far you get into the domestic licensing. in British Columbia right now, you don't require a license for domestic use. There's a few exemptions from use itself. Even though half of our 44,000 water licenses in BC are in fact domestic licenses, on a system that's not fully recorded, you do not require a domestic water license. So you can use water out of a large body for domestic purposes. So.
And how important is it to regulate those 22,000 surface domestic uses in your view?
It's somewhat important because I suspect the reason that people are actually getting water licenses is they are on systems that are perhaps small or fairly heavily used, so they're trying to protect their rights there before they become fully recorded. So that's one of the reasons. But in considering a future licensing regime for groundwater, we would probably mirror that approach where you would require licensing in heavy use areas, and perhaps in areas that's not so heavily used, where there's lots of groundwater or surface water, licensing may be optional. So perhaps mirroring that mirror image of the surface water licensing system.
So if there's lots of surface water and groundwater, why would one want to regulate it?
Because it won't always.
What would be the benefit cost of that?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's like any regulation that we do. You tend to focus on the higher, I want to say higher risk or higher use, or where you can actually start to feel an impact. But some of it is a choice with the individuals when it comes to surface water. They can choose to get a water license or not. In some areas, you have no choice. If it is close to fully recorded, that might be your only choice. But if you're in a large water body with very little licensing, a homeowner has a choice about whether to get a license or not.
The term oversubscription was used yesterday and today, and given a focus on in-stream flows, how would you explain to the Commissioner the importance of the term oversubscription as opposed to the term fully recorded, which is the term you just used? Can you explain that?
It is an interesting one because I think those of us in the water licensing business don't use the term oversubscribed as much. We tend to use fully recorded. That means that there is no more available flow for the licensing. Oversubscribed implies that there is more licenses than there is water, and that is the case in a number of areas. And really what that comes down to is it means that not all licenses can get satisfied at all times of the year. There is more license capacity than there is water. That might be a problem for individual licensees because they can't make full use of their allocation. It may or may not be a problem for some of the in-stream flows. In some cases where in-stream flows have some protection either within the license or some other mechanism, oversubscribed might not have an impact on the in-stream flows, but it might have an impact on other water users. So we term fully recorded when it means you can't issue any more water licenses for certain times of the year.
Turning to the current system, what tools do you have for in-stream flow protection under the Water Act?
I can think of 3 or 4 tools within the Water Act that we use to protect in-stream flows. The ones that we're using quite a bit, particularly with respect to some of the larger licenses like power licenses, many of them have most licenses have terms and conditions associated with them. The modern licenses will often have an in-stream flow clause that requires the licensee to keep certain flow in the water body at certain times of year, and it might depend on the time of year, but it is a condition of the license. So that's on the big licenses, the power licenses. That's very common these days. A second approach is, and I kind of alluded to this, it's regulating at times of scarcity. But some of the licenses actually have clauses that enable the regional water manager, the controller, to change the conditions of the license. So we might vary in-stream flow conditions, use conditions at a time of low flow. So it's direct regulation of the licensee. Sort of going up the list a little bit, well, I guess another in-stream flow one, there actually is conservation licenses. Of the 44,000 licenses, a number of them are strictly in place for conservation.
And what are those?
It's a license issued to an organization or a government or someone like that to keep water in a system for conservation purposes. A couple big examples come to mind. Ducks Unlimited is one of the big licensees for that. They maintain a number of dams and structures just to keep water in place for conservation purposes. I was thinking about this a little bit, and there was quite a bit of discussion here in the last couple of days about the Upper Nechako River. And I note that DFO actually holds a conservation license on the Upper Nechako for water for fish. So it is a licensable quantity. Another tool that we use, and it's available to, it's an order in council, it's available to cabinet to set water aside for certain purposes, and we do that for a number of uses. A fairly common use is where there's a significant ecological resource that we're trying to protect. And the one that comes to mind, particularly to this process here right now, is that I can note that there's a water reserve on the Adams River. I mean, obviously a very significant sockeye resource. And a number of years ago, the government decided to put that off limits to licensing. So it really preserves the flow in the Adams River, and that's the intent.
All right. I want to turn very briefly to IPPs. First of all, Ms. Panchak, could we have provincial tabs 8 and 9? Mr. Davidson, you're aware of books that have been put out about, first of all, independent power production in BC, an interagency guidebook for proponents, and this edition is in 2010. You're aware of that?
I am, yes.
I think you said you may have written an earlier version.
Yeah, that one's had several revisions to it. Yeah.
And then you're also aware of a July 2011 document, Clean Energy Project Development Plan Information Requirements.
Yes, I am, yeah.
So, Mr. Commissioner, when we get a chance, we'll mark those if we can. The question I have is, very briefly, how are in-stream flow requirements dealt with under a water license for IPPs? Very briefly.
Generally, I mean, it's a condition of the license. If there is an in-stream flow concern, that's identified during the licensing process, and it's written into the document, either directly or some clause related to the controller or the regional water manager will set in-stream flows as necessary or whatever. So there might be future documents that describe those in-stream flows, but it's a condition of the license.
All right. And finally, we've heard general enthusiasm about water use planning and BC Hydro over the last couple of days. First of all, I think you've been involved in those processes, haven't
Yes,
you?
I have. I've signed a number of them.
And so you'd agree that they're successful projects?
Yes,
For the most part.
Yeah.
My question is, what do they cost and who ends up paying for them?
There's a number of costs associated with them, but basically BC Hydro has put the plan together and done the consultation and paid much of the cost in assembling the plan itself. Once the plan gets implemented, there's a number of the costs associated with studies, with capital works, with loss of power or revenue because of the implication of the plan. Some of those costs are remittable to BC Hydro through their water rentals that they owe the province at the end of the year. We remit a certain amount of that money. It's capped. The program is capped to a maximum of $50 million annually, and we haven't hit that yet in the implementation of the water use planning process. But there's a clear expectation that this will cost the proponent, BC Hydro, over the long term, and that cost will be shared with the province.
And $50 million annually is a cap that's there for, so we're talking about many millions of dollars for these processes.
Yes.
Those are my questions, Mr. Commissioner. One more thing, as they say in the Colombo programs. Ms. Panchak, could I have provincial tabs 6 and 7? Oh, 7's been entered, so just tab 6. Mr. Davidson, this is a handbook for water suppliers updated July 2009 to dealing with drought?
Yes.
Thank you. That might be Mark, Mr. Commissioner.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. David Bursey from Rio Tinto Alcan. We have no questions. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Commissioner. I'm Karen Campbell here for the Conservation Coalition this afternoon. I believe I have 25 minutes allocated. I'd like to start with just returning back to the timelines associated with the Water Act modernization. Ms. Krywokin, just before lunch, there was slide put up on the screen that was summarizing the consultations and some of the stakeholder feedback around the Water Act modernization process. And one of the points that was made was that the timelines were too short. And I know that some stakeholders are of the view that that the timelines are too long. So I'm wondering if you could tell us which stakeholders think the timelines are too short.
We've had some 2,500 submissions on Water Act modernization. So to be specific on who, that was a general message from respondents that A, they wanted more time to review the details in the legislation, and B, take more time.
Right, and were there any sort of broad interests that were reflected, like the ranchers or the industrial users that would like the process to be extended?
It came from First Nations, in particular around time. The call for more input to detail legislative provisions came universally across the board.
Great.
That translates into more time.
Still on the topic of Water Act modernization, and I think I'd like to go to Exhibit 1856, which is the Proposed Water Sustainability Act. And I'd like to go to page 8, the first policy direction, which is protect stream health and aquatic environments. I know we've looked at this already. We heard yesterday from Dr. Orr that regulations would be more robust than guidelines. And we know that you're proposing to do in-stream flow guidelines in this act. And I'm wondering if you can give me a sense of how the ministry ranks guidelines, standards, and regulations. And the reason I'm asking is because if we look at this bubble on the right-hand side, it says, we heard that there was support for both guidelines and standards, but a preference for standards because guidelines are too flexible or not enforceable. And I'm a bit confused as to how the ministry ranks guidelines, standards, and regulations in terms of bindingness.
The guidelines, standards discussion has confused a lot of people, and we probably could have been clearer with our language in presenting this. And I'm going to defer to Mr. Davidson to speak to how guidelines and standards are incorporated into licensing decisions, and in particular with respect to in-stream flow needs.
Okay, so in that sense then, are guidelines and standards interchangeable substantially?
I'm going to ask Glenn to further elaborate.
Yeah, I mean, I don't find either guidelines or standards terribly enforceable on their own. I mean, enforceability really comes from the Act or some sort of tenuring document like a water license, or it's either in an Act or a regulation to an Act. Standards and guidelines are useful for the decision maker to make a decision and gives them some guidance on what to put into those documents. Sometimes standards are actually even referenced in legal documents. You must comply with these standards or something like that, so then they become useful. But on their own, I'm not sure that I would make too much of a distinction about which is more enforceable, standards or guidelines. What really makes them brings them into force is in the case of a water license or some sort of a tenuring document. So I can't say that I get too hung up on what's in their guidance. They're largely guidance to the decision maker and the proponent.
Thank you. And I know there was some questions also about the development of the in-stream flow guidelines. Do you expect that the development of those guidelines will be based primarily on science?
I've got a group of scientists working on the team.
Great. Thank you. I've got some questions now about groundwater. And I think we'll stick with the same document, and it's page 9. And we've talked about the fact that the intention is to regulate groundwater use in problem areas, and a bit about how problem areas might be defined. Has the province given any consideration to whether the Fraser watershed or parts of the Fraser watershed might be a problem area?
Yes.
And do you expect that at the end of the day the Fraser watershed will be identified as a problem area?
We haven't yet determined that we will be drawing lines on a map on the basis of what's a problem area and what's not. We laid out the framework and the policy, the 3 levels of action in the policy proposal paper. But it'll be based on more detailed analysis of the local site-specific situation.
And would you agree that the province would be better able to anticipate problem areas if you were licensing, monitoring, and tracking all groundwater extraction across the province?
All groundwater extraction across the province relevant to the Fraser?
I'm taking my question away from the Fraser specifically and over to the province, and this has to do with the notion that if we were licensing, monitoring, and tracking groundwater extraction across the province and keeping those sorts of records, that we would be better able to anticipate where the problem areas are going to be.
Yes.
Thank you. And we've also talked quite a bit about oversubscription or water stress and whether an area is fully recorded. And the sense that I have from reading these materials and from the evidence that we've heard so far is that the problem areas are being defined primarily by human uses and not necessarily by ecosystem needs, or not to the same extent by ecosystem needs. So the problem areas that have been mentioned have been the Gulf Islands and the Okanagan, which have a lot of human use. Do you think that salmon habitat might be a factor, or other ecosystem values would be a factor in defining problem areas?
Yes.
And one of the things we heard yesterday is that groundwater is crucial to maintaining Stewart Sockeye. And would you agree that the province might consider including the Stewart River watershed as a problem area, given its importance to sockeye?
Based on what I've heard from the science, yes.
Thank you. I've got a couple of questions that I'd like to ask a bit more about the water licensing system that we have in the province. Mr. Davidson, are there occasions where you've turned down license applications in areas where there's severe pressures on a stream?
Yeah, I mean, and I'm speaking broadly for I personally turn down water license applications when there's been not enough water, but it's quite common for our regional water managers to do that.
Thank you. And at this time in the current scheme, are you directly considering fisheries impacts in licensing decisions?
Yes, yes.
And does that happen sometimes, always, rarely?
I don't know if I would go so far as to say as always. If you're doing a small extraction on a very large water body, the consideration of fish resources is probably pretty small. But anything else where there's a significant withdrawal of water, yes, fisheries resources are considered.
And under the new scheme, is that going to increase? Will it happen more frequently, or will that consideration of fisheries impacts be substantially the same?
What we're talking about in a new regime is not just that you may consider, that you must consider. So it changes the decision maker's role a little bit, forcing him to turn his mind to that. Again, it's a proposal at this time that we're talking about.
No, I understand that. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. With respect to some of the water use reporting issues we discussed earlier, I think one of the points that was raised this morning is that water use reporting is required on about a quarter of the licenses at this time. Is that approximately correct?
Yeah, that was a rough estimate, and it may be even less than that.
Okay. And under the new Water Act, has there been any discussion of water use reporting being a condition in all new water licenses?
I think I'll defer to Lynn a little bit, but I'm not sure that we were talking about all, but certainly increasing the reporting.
And the proposal speaks of starting with large. Large being not single, individual domestics.
Right, and so it would be just large single users, not necessarily areas where there's a number of cumulative uses.
Certainly if there are water-stressed areas that point to the need for monitoring individual wells, yes. So there may be requirements imposed on individual well owners.
Okay.
Or surface licensees as well.
And Mr. Davidson, you've talked about auditing of water licenses that's done also for big users, and you mentioned independent power projects. Is it routinely done for independent power projects?
Auditing of them? Yes. Yes.
And is the auditing done by the Ministry of Environment, or is it done by an independent entity?
There's been a variety in the last few years where we've been looking at these in cooperation with some of our federal counterparts, sort of maybe a bit of a team approach where we've got a few people together, whether it's Conservation Officer Service, some of our water staff, as well as some DFO staff, and looked at some specific projects for compliance.
And are there occasions in the past few years, sort of taking, as I see it, there's two big baskets or ways of looking at it. There's the major users, and then there's the cumulative small incremental users that create stress on a region. Have you paid any specific attention to monitoring and auditing on this latter category of where there's a number of users in a region?
I would say we haven't done monitoring of the specific use in those ones, and probably by definition, those are the small users that individually perhaps aren't causing issues for the environment or for fish specifically. I think there you would take more of a watershed approach and see, you know, how heavily allocated is this, how heavily impacted it is. But I'm not sure looking at an individual water user would get you much further ahead there.
Right.
So we've done that as part of, you know, some of our water allocation, you know, planning or looking to see what's left to be, that could be allocated, available flow, that type of thing.
I'd like to go to Exhibit 662, which I believe was up on the screen already this morning. And as I heard this morning, I understand this has been before the commission before as well. There's a couple of parts of this that I'd like to ask you about, Mr. Wong. In the fourth paragraph of this memo, there's a reference to project splitting, and there's a statement that project splitting is a current issue resulting from a poorly coordinated referral system. I'm wondering if you could describe for me what you mean by project splitting. What's the issue that's being referred to here?
Well, certain kinds of development projects, and I can use an example, say a typical condo and marina development, will often come in to DFO for review as separate pieces. So we'll get a piece for a marina, and then we'll get a separate referral for, say, a boat launch, and then we may or may not get a separate referral for upland development. But it tends to all be part of the same development activity, and it would be more effectively managed and regulated if we were able to review it and consider it as a one singular project instead of three individual pieces of a project. So this point is describing that, and the challenge of connecting the dots sometimes that goes with making the regulatory decisions related to that.
Thank you. And are you aware of any project splitting that is occurring with regard to independent power projects?
A little bit. We have on occasion seen situations where parts of an IPP are not necessarily wrapped up in the specific proposal that we see. Things, say, like road access and other things like that that might be being treated as separate components.
Okay. And in paragraph 7 of the same note, there's a comment that says that we don't coordinate on referrals in any consistent way. What kind of referrals are you referring to here?
I was referring in general.
Okay.
I think and the point of this is that the coordination that I see happening from a management level in a regional or an area office happens largely as a result of local relationships, which isn't in itself bad, but what it does is it can leave gaps if the local views on things aren't necessarily covering all of the bases, and it can lead to a fairly significant inconsistency across a large management area like we have in the BC Interior.
Great, thank you. And just on the theme of project splitting and environmental assessment, I'm just going to talk a little bit about environmental assessment for a moment. Ms. Krywokin, do independent power projects require that provincial environmental assessments be conducted before they're built?
The trigger for the formal environmental assessment process is 50 megawatts. So under that, they're not required to have a certificate.
And would it be possible to split a project into smaller projects to avoid the requirement to conduct an environmental assessment?
There is a bit of oversight on that from the EA. They may choose to include a project because they feel it's splitting. You could go the other way too. You could combine several small projects and ask that it be reviewed as an entirety under the EA process as well. But I would say not generally. I'm seeing projects being split to do that. It's kind of obvious if that's the case.
I'm wondering, there's an example of a project in the Fraser River watershed, and it's on the Holmes River. And I'm just wondering if you're aware of an independent power project where it appears that there's a total of 10 licenses that have been granted for a total of 76 megawatts of power production. So it's 10 licenses on a row of streams that go into the Holmes River. Are you familiar with this project at all?
Yeah, I'm not directly, but I've heard of that one, and I know where the Holmes River is, yes.
Great, thanks very much. On to the issue of excuse me, one moment. I'd like to just discuss the 2009 drought very briefly, and I know that we had already had up on the screen the BC Drought Response Plan. I'm wondering if we could go to page 9, which is PDF page 12 of that plan. And I note that there's a section here, 224, on water bailiffs. And it's the part of the drought plan that discusses Water Act provisions for water bailiffs, which are can come in and be used to manage conflicts in a stream before or during a drought. And it's under the authority of the existing Water Act. Do Mr. Davidson or Ms. Crywelkin, do you know if this provision was used at all during the 2009 drought?
I'm not sure if it was used specifically for a 2009 drought, but water bailiffs are used, particularly in dry areas. So yeah, I can't confirm that there were water bailiffs in place there, but I suspect that there were, because we use them even not in drought conditions. There's often a number of water bailiffs regulating systems where there's multiple users.
Right. And in that context too, I know we also talked about Section 9 of the Fish Protection Act, which was brought into force in 2009, and that was the section that deals with temporary water withdrawals by license holders in cases of drought. And I'm not sure I heard your evidence correctly. Did you say that that was actually used in the 2009 drought?
It was at.
Yes.
Great, thank you very much. And I'm not sure whether this would be for Ms. Crywelkin or Mr. Davidson, but are you also aware of some of the other sections of the Fish Protection Act that are not in force?
Yes.
And specifically, I'm interested in some of the sections that talk about the ability to authorize the water controller to consider fish and fish habitat considerations in licensing. This is Section 5 of the Fish Protection Act, which isn't in force. Based upon the information you've just provided, Mr. Davidson, when you're saying that in the future that the government must consider fisheries impacts under the new Water Act, is that really the same as Section 5 of the Fish Protection Act?
I don't know about the specifics. We're certainly looking at the unclaimed provisions of the Fish Protection Act as we produce the Water Sustainability Act. There's the requirement for consideration of fish and fish habitat. There's the stream flow protection license provision. There's another one respecting reduction of use where there's a water management plan. And collectively, we're looking at all of those unproclaimed provisions as part of this exercise in Water Act modernization.
Great, so you're definitely giving consideration to proclaiming into force those unenforced provisions
And
of
in
the
fact,
Act.
it may be Fish Protection Act standalone, or that may be amalgamated into a broader Water Sustainability Act. How that's packaged is yet to be determined.
That's great, thanks very much. Those are all my questions, Mr. Commissioner, thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Commissioner. It's Brenda Gartner, and with me, Michael Bissonnette. Good afternoon, panel. I have the chosen time of the late afternoon on a Friday, so we'll bear with me and we'll see how well we do together. I am going to start with some of the matters that were summarized a little bit with council from the province, and then I'm going to probably end up having some discussions about water use planning. So we'll go there, start there, and hopefully within the time allotted that I have, I can cover all the areas that I want. I'm just going to start with some basics. That's part of the evidentiary challenge. But can all of the panel confirm that's your working knowledge and understanding that water management within the Fraser watershed has the potential to infringe the exercise of Section 35 fishing rights? Is that correct? All of you are working with that knowledge, that you have that water management has the potential to infringe.
Let me start there. There's
Sorry, I just see Mr. Tyzik coming forward. So
I mean, there's a.
This is an operative question. They're all acting on behalf of the Crown, all three of them, and one of them is for a Crown corporation. It's the application of the law. In their minds, when they're looking at the application of the law, do they recognize that there's a potential to infringe Section 35 fishing rights when
Thank
dealing?
you.
That's what I said.
No,
Section 35 fishing
what
rights.
You said Section 35 rights. Fish.
Section 35 fishing rights. I just want to.
if the question is the witnesses' understanding that they carry with them into their work each day, then I think the question is a fair one, Mr. Commissioner.
Thank you.
Sure. Let me start there. We make a number of Water Act decisions, and statutory decision makers consider possible infringements on each one of those decisions. Yes.
Mr. Wong, in your work with First Nations and fish, you're clearly aware that water management issues has the potential to infringe their Section 35 fishing rights. Is that correct?
Yes, I would agree with that. It's in the same kind of context as other development issues that would come under our regulatory regime.
And you all agree that establishing the necessary consultative processes has been a challenge.
That's a fairly broad statement. There's certainly plenty of challenges there, but I'm not sure if there's something more specific you're referring to.
We're going to get to way more specifics, but you'll agree that you don't have consultative processes in place that are agreeable to First Nations yet. The application of the law is somewhat challenging for you, given the number of First Nations that we have and the complexity of the issues.
I would, you know, across a number of statutory decisions, some of the consultation with some of the First Nations goes very well. The processes seem to work very well. Other ones not as well.
All right. So let's start. When the Water Modernization Act proposal came in, there was a call for submissions from interested groups. Is that correct, Ms. Kriwoken?
Yes.
And if I could have tabs 2, 3, 4, and 5, I'll begin with tab 2. You're familiar with the UBCIC submission dated April 30th, 2010 that was in response to the call for submissions?
Yes.
Could I have that marked as the next exhibit?
1884.
And tab 3, that's the First Nations Fisheries Council, who is a client in this of My First Nations Coalitions. Their submission dated April 30th, 2010. You're familiar with that?
Yes, I am.
Have that marked as the next exhibit. Assembly of First Nations response, also dated April 30th, 2010. You're familiar with that? Have that marked as the next exhibit.
1886.
And finally, at tab 5 is the ONA submission, which is the Okanagan Nation Alliance, whose territory is within the Okanagan. You're familiar with that submission?
Yes.
And that's an example. I didn't want to put all of them in, but you got many submissions from First Nations in response to your call for submissions, correct?
We received 25.
Yeah. And just while I'm marking exhibits, let's go to tab 6, which is the First Nations Leadership Council letter, which is the which includes the UBCIC, the Summit, and the AFN's response most recently to the policy document. You're familiar with that?
Yes, I am.
And can I have that marked as the next exhibit?
1887.
Okay, so now that we've got the exhibits, you summarized in your material, and I don't need to belabor this, but that there were some similarities of concerns that were raised by First Nations across the board. That's correct?
That's correct.
And one of them included the provincial assertion of jurisdiction over water within the traditional lands and watersheds of First Nations, and that must be reconciled with the existing Aboriginal rights and title as it relates to water.
Yes.
And another one is that they wanted a more robust consultative process for addressing water issues within their territory. Is that correct?
Yes.
And that they needed a more appropriate and inclusive government-to-government process for the Water Act modernization process.
Yes.
And finally, that their deep connection to water and water resources and their sacred relationship included a responsibility to manage and protect that water, and that needed to be considered.
Yes.
Now, I want to try to see if we can zero in. We're not going to obviously have the time to deal with all of the issues on Water Act modernization and the Crown relationships to First Nations, but let's just try to stick to fish and see where we go with that. And for that, I'm going to turn to what was tab 3, which is now exhibit 1885, which is the First Nations Fisheries Council's response for submissions. And if I could go to, I believe it's about PDF page 8. That's the, if you go to the page just before it, that'll familiarize yourself with where we are in the document, or the page before it again. So Appendix B was setting out a list of specific comments and concerns around the modernization discussion paper, and they started with principles, and if you keep scrolling down now, so they set out all the principles that they wanted to have a dialogue and had some concerns about. Keep going, I just want to familiarize. And then specifically they set out a number of concerns starting on that page 3 of the document with improved water governance. And in particular, they sought a collaborative development of watershed plans completed at the watershed level as a basis for more effective and accountable watershed management and governance. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And how have you responded to that suggestion and proposal?
Well, in fact, Improving water governance is one of the goals of Water Act modernization, and in the policy proposal and even the lead-in discussion paper, we've identified the need to enhance our governance arrangements and look for opportunities through local entities, whether it be First Nation, a local government, a regional government, to take on some functions related to water management that incorporate local interest, with the proviso that there still be provincial oversight.
So is there any specific requirement for the development of watershed plans completed at a watershed level as it relates to water management and fish?
There's, in the current Water Act, under Part 4, there's a water management plans are enabled to do just that.
But is there any plans under the Water Act modernization to implement that at a more strategic level to deal with the overarching concerns within the Fraser watershed?
That is part of the proposal.
How are you going to do it?
Water resource assessments and watershed, the proposal makes reference to watershed sustainability plans.
So these are approaches that would need budgeting, and they would need direct engagement with First Nations. Is that correct?
These are broad-based consultative processes that would include every party that has an interest in a given watershed.
Now, we've heard a little bit about this, and so I'm going to dive into this one, protection of stream health and aquatic environments. And you'll see specifically within that paragraph that there, it's the second paragraph down, the First Nations Council is supportive of measures that will directly protect the health and integrity of streams and aquatic environments by legislating environmental flow standards on fish-bearing streams that account for water flow needs at various life history stages: spawning, incubation, emergence, migration, and rearing. Fish and other aquatic organisms may be considered priority users of the water resources and be offered some measure of protection within the water allocation system. Environmental flow standards may also protect overall watershed health by recognizing the value and function of ecosystem services. I'll just stop there for a second. Mr. Wong, would you agree that that would be a useful thing for fish management?
You're talking about the statement as a whole, or just the last part?
Legislating environmental flow standards on fish-bearing streams.
From a fisheries oceans perspective, that would be fine.
Would be excellent, in fact.
Sure.
Would you agree with me on that?
Well, it would certainly provide for more protection than fish have now.
Thank you. And in fact, if we can go to your DFO document, which is now Exhibit 1874, perhaps you'll remember this, and I'll find it if, oh, there it is. Analysis. Second bullet. Current federal legislation protects fish habitat but does not provide explicit direction about restoring water flows for fish in oversubscribed systems. That's a problem that you recognized when looking at the Water Modernization Act?
Yes.
And in fact, legislating environmental flow standards would help that problem, wouldn't it?
We would think so, yes.
Yesterday we talked, I think all of you were mainly in the room when we were talking about Exhibit 1863, which is the report in which they suggest maintaining in-stream flows. Now, if I go to Exhibit 8, if we could go to Exhibit 1856 now, which is your policy Yeah, 1856. Let's go to page 8 and 9. If I read this document, we don't have legislating environmental flow standards at all. Is that correct? We've got policy directions and some standards, but we've got no move towards legislating environmental flow standards. Is that correct?
We may not use those words in the proposal. The response back to the proposal was that environmental flow standards in this particular example that you're using is being recommended.
Are you intending to legislate the requirements for environmental flow standards?
We're intending to require decision makers to consider in-stream flows in their decisions.
But that will be for future applications, is that correct?
Yes, but that doesn't take away from the existing framework for allocation and protection of in-stream flows with existing licensees and a staged approach to draw on other tools like Section 9 of the Fish Protection Act.
So essentially at this point in time, we still have the same problem, which is that we don't have environmental flow standards that take into consideration fish when managing streams within the watershed?
I think the end goal is to protect fish habitat, stream health. The technical working group working on in-stream flow needs is getting into the technical details of what that looks like and how it's operationalized.
Are there First Nations representatives on the technical working group?
We've got First Nations representatives on our technical advisory committee.
Is there any on the technical working group?
No, but we bring the in-stream flow needs discussion into our technical advisors group.
All right, so let's go to the next one then, on back to tab 8, or exhibit 1885. You go back to PDF. Oh no. Yeah, if you go, or page PDF 8, and then go down to probably about 10 now. And right at the beginning, the articulation of the concern around groundwater was due to the connections and interactions between groundwater and surface water. The First Nations Fisheries Council is supportive of the intention to regulate groundwater, but the regulation should be applied across British Columbia and not just in priority areas. As a source of stored water and as a contributor to surface waters, regulation of groundwater is necessary to protect an important water supply for extraction and exploitation, and to protect against what may be irreversible changes to the hydrological cycle if groundwater reservoirs are allowed to be fully extracted. Now I'll just stop there. That's a pretty concise statement of the nature of the concerns. Mr. Wong, when you were talking earlier today about some of the challenges under the Fisheries Act, and in particular Section 35, and as I heard your evidence, you were speaking mainly about even surface water and the challenges there. You'll agree with me that you are even more challenged to prove direct causation between the use of groundwater and fish habitat. Is that correct?
Yes, I'd agree with that.
And so in the areas of fish protection, groundwater will even become more important to have strong legislative tools.
Yeah, I think I spoke earlier this morning. It's very challenging to use the provisions of the Fisheries Act to achieve that.
Now, if I heard it right, Ms. Kriwokan, that the priority areas so far that you've identified are two areas where the municipalities have made it clear to you, or the local governments have made it clear to you that those are priorities, and that's in the Okanagan and in the Gulf Islands. Is that correct?
Those are but two examples that I cited.
So I want to know, is it important for us to have our First Nations clients complaining a lot in order for priority areas to be identified, or how are we going to get priority areas identified that are meaningful for fish?
It's a good question, and it's one we're currently looking at as we identify the goals of the Water Sustainability Act and how we operationalize. Whether we designate areas in the Act or by regulation through further detailed assessment, water supply demand, further technical analysis that would follow through the regulation. Those operational details have not been fully worked through yet.
All right, and then just finally, and these are all topics we've talked about, but I think it's important that the commissioners see the details in which First Nations responded to your call for submissions. I want to go to the last item, which is introduction of more flexibility and efficiency in the water allocation system. And if you go to the next page, you'll see a whole list of concerns they've raised, and you're familiar with these concerns as it relates to the water allocation system. Is that correct?
Yes.
And at the end of those concerns, what they're calling for is a meaningful consultation process. Is that correct?
That's what I read.
Have you had direction to develop a robust tripartite consultative process between First Nations, the province, and the Department of Fisheries and Oceans to address these concerns regarding water and fish through the Water Management Act, water modernization process?
What are you reading from?
I'm asking you a question. Have you got direction yet to develop a robust tripartite consultative process between First Nations, the province, and the Department of Fisheries and Oceans to address concerns regarding water and fish through the Water Modernization Act process?
No, I haven't.
And will you seek those directions?
If you'd like me to speak to the engagement process that we have underway, I'm happy to do that.
Well, you recognize that in the letter that was sent to you subsequent to the policy being addressed, that the Leadership Council has asked for a direct consultative process at a strategic level between the province and the department and yourself as it relates to fish and other matters.
So as I recall that letter, we may want to
Sorry, I'll
bring it
just
up.
interrupt the witness. I see Mr. Townsend.
Yeah, I mean, Ms. Krywokin is here to deal with the WAM process. If there's a request that's been made to the minister, that would be a response that would come from the minister. She's here to explain what the process is right now.
She's got it. She has the wonderful job of trying to implement this process, as I've understood it. Well, let's go this way. Do you think it would be a useful thing for you to have a clear, tripartite consultative process between First Nations, yourself, and the Department of Fisheries and Oceans to see how to implement the Water Modernization Act in a manner that looks after fish and First Nations concerns?
Those three entities that you've described, absolutely. It doesn't stop there.
No, but having that one's a good start. Would you agree?
Yes, and I'm fully aware of the request of the First Nations Leadership Council to further engage government to government. And the minister has responded in a favorable response to, over this next year, to consult on a legislative draft, as well as have further technical workshops with First Nations on some of these specific policy directions.
Great. And Mr. Wong, would you agree that that would also be helpful for you as a representative of DFO when dealing with the complexities associated with fish and First Nations issues, to have a clear tripartite consultative process in place between yourselves, the province, and First Nations?
I can certainly see the benefits of that.
I'm going to move on to something perhaps a little simpler, and that's in this whole area of sensitive streams. Now, Mr. Davidson, I think these are questions for you, and I'll take you to the documents if you need them, but they're the Auditor General reports that are already in exhibits, in particular, if you want to bring it up, Exhibit 1862. Now, in those reports, and that was the 2004 and the 2005 report, and I'm sure you're familiar with them, correct?
Yeah, it's probably been a while since I've looked at any of that, but okay.
Well, let's go to page 37. And on that page, it says that the Fish Protection Act provides for the development of recovery plans for sensitive streams, but no current provincial efforts are underway to develop these plans. Is that correct?
Which recovery plans?
Yeah, recovery plans for sensitive streams.
There have been none to my knowledge.
Yeah, and I'm just trying to confirm whether there's any ongoing work on it. I'm not aware of any, but.
All right, and then there were 15 streams designated back in 1997, but there haven't been any other streams designated since then. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So just tell me, earlier today you talked about, the suggestion was made about it's great to have legislation, but it's challenging to implement it and have the resources. And your response to that was, well, if we do the legislation under the Water Modernization Act, we'll have to have a legislative package that includes implementing it. What comfort are we going to get if there was 15 sensitive streams designated in 1997 and there haven't been any since then? The Auditor General has concerns about that. What comfort can we take that you'll have the resources to implement the Water Modernization Act, given the high policy goals and standards that are set out there?
Are you addressing specifically me?
Yes.
I think I responded to it. I can't speak to the. I mean, it's a package. You know, you put in a package with legislature. There's also a number of analysis that goes on related to the cost of implementing it, resources required. It is a package. I can't speak to what government will do with that package, and I don't know that I'm going to speculate on my confidence that government's going to reflect work done by Lynn and myself. It's a question for government at the time they consider it.
And Ms. Krywokin, do you have anything to add around that? I mean, you're doing a consultative process that includes broad policies and broad standards, and which on their face of it are clearly going to be difficult to implement on the ground, that are going to require resources. What confidence do you have, and could you provide to my clients, for example, that the principles and the approaches that are set out in this policy are actually going to, the rubber's going to hit the road and we're going to see differences for fish?
I draw from my experience in developing legislation over the course of my career and defining, once the proposals are defined, we clearly articulate the resource requirements to implement. We look at different approaches, different phasing, all that fall within the broad construct and the broad vision, and we put that to government for consideration.
One of the things that I got concerned earlier today when you were talking about the, I'm just going to put my notes so that I don't overstate things, which I have a tendency sometimes of doing. And, you know, I heard that there were guidelines and standards around in-stream flows that may be more regulation in times of scarcity, and that there may be more flexibility in extenuating circumstances for drought management. But I kept hearing that when describing that we're really talking about competition between human uses. And I really don't know how fish are going to have a place at this table. And given you know, that it's often very difficult for you to deal with competing human consumptions, how is fish going to have a place at this table? How are they going to have a voice?
One of the most significant shifts in the Water Sustainability Act from the Water Act is sustainability and consideration of stream health, of which fish are reliant. It's a fundamental shift from an allocation tool to a sustainability tool. Fish can't speak in terms of their licenses and pay their annual rentals, but the goal is to ensure that fish are considered in statutory decisions. That's the in-stream flow requirements, the groundwater protection regulation, the connecting the water and the land provisions, so that what happens on the water and on the land base that affects water and ultimately affects fish. The whole collection of the 7 policy directions collectively work towards protecting stream health on which fish rely.
Would you agree with me that one of the clearest ways, perhaps, of ensuring that fish have a place at the table is to ensure that First Nations, who have a direct and long-standing, historic, sacred relationship to those fish, have a place at the table?
Yes.
And everybody else in the panel agree with that?
I'm not sure that I can make I agree with that, a blanket agreement, because I think each First Nation is different and their interests are all different. Some are power producers, some are not. Some have quite a link with salmon, some not. So it sounds like kind of a broad statement to agree with.
All right, you're having difficulty with that. Mr. Wong, in your work with First Nations, would you agree that when they come to the table to deal with fishing matters and water matters, that one of the ways of ensuring that fish have a place at the table is to ensure that First Nations have a place at the table?
I would say in general, in my experience, First Nations are generally very passionate and effective advocates for fish, but much like Glenn's saying, I can't say that always at all times. There are some instances where certain First Nation communities have other interests that don't always reflect a fish-first approach.
All right. And Mr. Higgins, I saw you nodding yes earlier. Are you staying with that one?
I'm considering what my esteemed panel member said, but what I've experienced is that when First Nations come to the table, they're very passionate and they do provide that voice.
Thank you. I'm going to just clean up a couple of things that arose on the evidence, and then perhaps it would be an appropriate time. Ms. Farlinger, the present regional director, on December 16th gave evidence, and she was answering questions of Mr. Leadham at the time, and specifically talking about Water Act and authorizations under the Water Act, and specifically mentioned that she didn't believe that DFO has access to all of the information under Water Act authorization for Water Act authorizations. And I just wondered if we could clear up this evidentiary question, because does DFO have access to Water Act and Water Act authorizations, or I suppose just say like Water Act authorizations, and in particular stream authorizations, and the understanding of who's using how much water and where?
I'm not sure I can help that much. I can speak locally in terms of our area operations, and I would say that if we were looking for that kind of information, I've never seen a situation where we've had a problem getting that from our provincial counterparts, but I can't say that I know specifically what Ms. Farlinger was speaking to.
Mr. Davidson, do you know, is there a way and a clear way of providing information to the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, not only on what's licensed, but what's used?
Yeah, I was going to speak to what's licensed is relatively easy. It's actually all on the web. So that's the primary decisions that we do. So that information is readily available. The data, I mean, the data on water use and that we collect is all public information. It's probably, we don't distribute it probably as easy as we do our water licenses, but it's there for the asking, I would say.
We will now recess for 10 minutes.